Hi everyone, my name is Kate Adkins, and this is my presentation for Prompt 2 for my master's portfolio from the University of West Georgia, and I'm pursuing the master's in education. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. Of course, this prompt was all about being a reflective teacher, and the article that I chose to read was the Matthew, and Pachatu article. And in that article, it said that reflection is a well defined and crafted practice that carries very specific meaning and associated action. So, as a classroom teacher, what that means to me is it's my responsibility to consistently reflect on my teaching strategies and methods weekly and even daily. So, through continuous reflection, I can evaluate my effectiveness as a teacher and identify areas of strength and need. The success of my students is what is of the utmost importance to me. So, identifying areas for improvement pushes me to acquire new approaches and methodologies that will in turn benefit my students' growth. And within the article, Matthew, and Pachatu state that reflection is a cyclical process. So, it's consistently changing, going, you're always reflecting on what you're doing. And enriching my teaching toolkit through reflection, evaluation, and adaptation will improve my abilities as a teacher as well as my students' chance of achieving success. When it comes to utilizing my peers to help me reflect, at my school, we have CCCs. It's called Collaborative Communities. And these communities allow for teachers in the same grade level and even different grade levels to come together in a judgment free space and dig deeper into maybe some inconsistencies or successes that you've experienced in this classroom. And this helps to provide feedback to my peers and also me to give them feedback and also receive constructive dialogue that encourages reflective practices to help me and the rest of my team continue to grow in our craft. And seeking out the guidance and support of experts at my school helps to aid me in identifying those areas for improvement in my teaching. Through other people's perspectives, I'm able to highlight and refine those specific skill sets that help me stay committed to the growth of my students. My experiences as a student teacher and now classroom teacher have continued to shape the educator that I am today. This spans from big things like instructional practices to small things like the questions I use during my daily morning meeting. Each student in my classroom deserves the most effective Miss Adkins, and in order to be my most effective self, I continue to seek out opportunities for growth to better meet the needs of my students. Through reflection of past teaching and learning experiences, I'm able to identify and sympathize with the importance of differentiating my teaching to support all learners in the classroom. Additionally, adding student cultures, traditions, histories, and identities to everything that I do provides a sense of belonging. So when you pair that community with tailored instruction, it provides a supportive, safe, and effective learning environment for your students. The lesson that I chose to reflect on is a first grade science unit on light, specifically having to do with shadows. I developed this lesson and it spanned the course of 1 week where students engaged with, investigated, and evaluated shadows. The goals for the unit included being able to identify the change in an object's shadow as the placement of the sun in the sky changes, being able to understand that in order for shadow to appear, the object must be blocked, the object must block the light, and lastly, that they learn about how shadows are created and they can use it to, help them in their everyday life. In my initial reflection of the first time I taught it, it was taught to a group of 22 students comprised of ELL students and Gen Ed students. I engaged all of my learners by introducing the lesson with a picture book so that even my students with a language barrier could understand the concept. I had students participate in turn and talk with a peer who could model using the correct vocabulary and sentence stems. And along with modeling and utilizing peer partnerships, differentiated recording sheets and journaling responses were provided to students with specific needs. So I tried really hard to, engage them as best as I could. Strategies that seem to work within the lesson, the initial time I taught it, would be gradual release of responsibility. I do, we do, you do. Modeling a lot for them, student conversation, and hands on experience based learning. We all know that our kids learn best when they are doing. So, giving them that experience based learning where they are hands on is so important. Strategies that didn't seem to work within the lesson, student autonomy over certain choices. So I let them pick their object the first time, and that didn't go well because there weren't shadows being made because the object was too small, or they wanted to bring a chair outside, and that was just like, oh, we can't get that done. So having them make certain choices that I think I learned, nope, I need to make those choices. And student use of technology. We use technology to help us in our culminating writing project. And I don't think it was necessarily the best choice because we got sidetracked or we had technological issues. So taking that technology piece out of it just for the culminating writing piece. Last, the lesson itself was meant to last the course of 1 week. However, weather constraints, outside factors affecting my instructional time, and components of the lesson taking longer than expected, the initial teaching took a longer than a week, and I felt like the lesson kind of became drawn out and ineffective. When I initially taught the lesson, I had already integrated writing into it just because, if students can write about it, that means that they understand it. So I chose to integrate informational writing, and this included different activities. We used informational writing by answering stems, writing predictions, and researching using leveled texts. Their knowledge with this specific writing subset really showed through in their work, and that encouraged me when revising to integrate another subject into the lesson. And I chose to integrate math, specifically writing time to the hour and half hour and telling time as well. So what I changed in my lesson was I integrated that math standard MDR 6.2, tell and write time in hours and half hours using analog and digital clocks. The duration of the lesson went from 5 days to 3 days. I included a lot more teacher modeling and think aloud to activate their prior knowledge at the beginning of the lesson. I also chose to front load more vocabulary at the beginning of the lesson and not include technology needed for research, and gave more time for student teacher conversation. And here's my recording. Skipping past that, you can watch it on my website. It is located on my Google Sites for my master's portfolio. And now I'll move into what I can reflect on after teaching the lesson for a second time. I would say that my successes, I chose to video the opening engage piece of the lesson because that's where I give explicit whole group instruction. Successes starting the lesson with a connection to my students' lives helped them to understand the purpose for learning. Allowing them to share with a partner during turn and talk also provided them the opportunity to work on those necessary speaking and listening skills that they need to develop. Throughout the lesson, explicit modeling and the use of movement helped my students to understand specific content vocabulary, like putting their hand up and blocking. That helps them understand it is blocked, it stops the light. Students were engaged during the lesson, as evidenced through their excitement and participation in my recording. And I monitored student learning through proximity and participation. And through that, I was able to really keep them engaged, I feel. However, at this point in the learning process, we're still engaged in the I do, we do component of the lesson. So measurement of individual student learning occurred later on in the lesson on day 2 and 3. My approaches for the changes that I made were simply because I wanted to deepen my students' understanding of the concept of shadows. In the initial lesson, I jumped straight into the read aloud without providing explicit vocabulary instruction or activating their prior background knowledge. So, allocating that time for conversation and student discourse aided in their understanding, giving them that chance to talk about it with their peers, to hear what their peers have to say, sharing with each other, and then kind of like working on that really helped get them that understanding, I feel, from the beginning that was missing in my initial teaching. Through the integration of telling time to the hour and half hour, I wanted my students to understand that shadows move throughout the day in a pattern, and that this can help them predict or even plan for activities based on where shadows might be during the time of day. So if they want to go to the park with their family, they know that maybe later in the afternoon, the sun would be at a certain point in the sky, so there might be more shadows, and it wouldn't be as hot outside if they, say, went to the park in the summer. Applying that like real life experience to what they're learning so they know that there's a reason why they're learning it. And then lastly, I wanted the learning to be meaningful. So changing the lesson from 5 days to 3 days ensured that there wasn't anything getting lost in the time constraints that we had. I feel like I didn't want them to focus too much on the writing. I didn't want them to focus on the math. I wanted them to take all of the pieces and put them together to really understand the concept of shadows. When it comes to cultural diversity, I feel that I tried my best to model for my students a lot during the lesson using sentence stems, movement, and simple language. The inclusion of multiple opportunities for peer interactions also aided their comprehension. So, those ELLs and my inclusion students who have learning delays or learning disabilities, I really tried to give them that opportunity for multiple peer interactions and simple language and movement to aid in their instruction. Also, by connecting the concept of shadows to everyday lives, I feel like I hit that community engagement simply because my students, I want them to understand that like the shadows are an everyday thing. And we engaged in conversations about what them and their families do together. And this can be heard in the video recording when I asked them about where they've seen a shadow in their everyday life. And I think that kind of tied in that community piece. As evidenced in my student work samples, I provided sentence stems, graphic organizers, and differentiated recording sheets to meet the needs of all of the learners in my classroom, and individualized and small group instruction were also utilized to assist in confirming student learning. I do believe that I was successful in teaching my students what a shadow is and how it's created and why it moves throughout the day, with evidence of student work samples and consistent use of vocabulary during student-led conversation. So when I was listening in, when I was giving them that chance to talk, they were able to use those specific vocabulary words that help me understand that they know what a shadow is. Student engagement, I do believe that in both lessons my students were engaged, but it was notably higher in the revised lesson, providing them that opportunity for student-led conversation centered on their lived experiences, set a purpose for their learning, which I think in turn heightened their engagement. Obviously, when you set a purpose for it and it relates to their everyday life, they're going to be more engaged. I think we've learned that in all of our master's courses, and that's something that we as teachers need to keep in our teacher toolkit because it helps our students stay engaged. They were even more engaged in their individual shadow experience than in my initial teaching because they possessed a clear understanding of the concept. I feel like before in my initial teaching, I jumped right in. We read that read aloud, we went outside, and we measured. So I think because we took a lot more time for conversation and modeling, they were excited to track the shadows their objects made because they understood that when they went outside, it was going to be in a different place because the light source had changed in its place in the sky. And I do think that student learning changed for the better and increased due to the changes in approach and instructional strategies. Not only did they comprehend the concept of shadows, they connected how they changed throughout the day based on time, and they applied it to their everyday lives. The integration of telling time to the hour and the half hour to aid in the concept of shadows felt seamless. The read aloud bear shadow that was heard in my video recording focuses on how and why Bear cannot get rid of his shadow. Having students record the times and directions of their shadows directly connected to the phenomenon that Bear experienced. So taking that text connection and putting it to real life and seeing that it's similar. And the integration of writing to tell Bear why he couldn't get rid of his shadow allowed students to convey their understanding through teaching their reader. The students used their knowledge of shadows paired with how they move throughout the day to explain to Bear the problem that he was having. Overall, I think the class was successful in achieving the stated learning goals on slide 5. The revision of the lesson to meet the needs of all learners proved effective and valuable. Students were engaged in the inclusive activities and they showed mastery of the concept taught. 2 students, specifically their initials AW and EJ, demonstrated deep understanding and produced exemplary work. So in order to extend their learning, I thought I would include an elapsed time component. The students would be given a time and they would have to predict based on their shadow's last placement and knowledge of the light being blocked where the shadow would be at a new time and how many hours had passed. So I thought that would be a nice way to extend the students who showed a little bit more of understanding than those who are still striving or working to understand the concept. And here's just a few examples of student learning. I have a graphic organizer showing that a student used the word block and that they can move. And then I have another piece from where they told Bear why they couldn't get rid of their shadow. And she used the word his body blocked the light from the sun. So they understand that the shadow is created because they blocked the light. And here are my recording sheets for their shadows. You can see one has just digital and one has analog and digital. I did that just so that students wouldn't get bogged down. That's the differentiation piece. And I wanted them to feel confident in what they were doing. So here's those. And then influences from the graduate courses, I would say there were 3 big influences for this reflection aspect. I would say the first was the investigating science methods. That 5E lesson and integration of content areas really helped me to pick and choose what would aid in the comprehension of the concept. I think this was the class that kind of made me think, oh, all of the content areas can be intertwined some way, somehow. And specifically using that 5E lesson, it shows you where you could put those different content areas to make a culminating project or understanding of what the concept was. So I really used what I learned in that science methods class. Also, the diverse classrooms in global society, that culturally responsive toolkit. I think that class really opened up my eyes to all of the different things you can do to help make sure out your all of your learners are included. So having those strategies in my pocket when trying to think about what I could do to not only engage but make sure I was reaching my students the way I needed to helped. And last was the school and classroom assessment course. And that was the informal assessments role in the classroom. I think a lot of the time we get bogged down in making sure we have a paper that shows what our students learned and that we have like physical evidence. And of course, that's important. But the informal assessments of just listening in and checking in or going around with the checklist and checking off if they use the word block helps us to really, take that data and drive our instruction right in the moment. It doesn't always have to be a culminating piece. We can hear something and we can pivot and we can do what we need to do to meet that learner's needs. I will say each course at the graduate level has enhanced who I am as an educator. I will continue to be more successful and effective through the experiences and learning that I've participated in over the past 2 years. Inclusivity, effective differentiation, assessment, and data-driven instruction are all cornerstones of my pedagogy that I will continue to implement in my classroom. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope you have a great day.